Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Dawson and I'm Director of the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. I'd like to thank the Museums Association for inviting me to participate in this excellent conference, and congratulations to all of the organisers for putting together such a diverse and illuminating programmes over the past 2 days. I'm chairing this session, Dissenting Artists, and I'm delighted to introduce my panellists, artists Amanda Dunsmore and Seamus Nolan, and curator Owen Dara. Just before we begin, I was just discussing and reflecting on what the world would be like without art. It would indeed be a very dull place, to be devoid of creativity and to be devoid of imagination, and without imaginative approaches to addressing the complexities of existence. It really doesn't bear thinking about. Over the millennia, art has always challenged the accepted norms and shown other ways of looking at the world. Dissent is inherent in art, and we've seen how art challenges the status quo, the realities as they see them, how we are perceived, and who is represented. What are the contexts, the perspectives? What and who has been put in, and what and who has been left behind? As we move on through the 21st century, these are among the key issues in society, issues which are addressed through current art practices. Even using the traditional media such as sculpture, painting and drawing, and the more relatively new media of film, video, installation, these artists, bringing unique and original viewpoints, address issues of civil and human rights, climate change, democracy, capitalism, migration, economy and society. Counterpoints to populist thinking and indeed stereotypes. In the sense of taking a position, art is political. The artist gives their personal viewpoint and has the freedom to express it. The Art of Dissent was one of the topics at the World Economic Forum annual meeting last year, and I quote, "In a time of political and economic uncertainty, the role of art and expression has never been so important. They bring new perspectives to tackle challenging issues and inspire people to fulfill their potential." At the Hugh Lane, we have, over a long period now, made it one of our priorities in our exhibition programming and in our learning programs to redefine the role of the museum in terms of platforming participatory and collaborative practices which address current issues in social and political. Each of the panelists will discuss their practice, and then I will, I hope, invite a lively discussion from the floor. And now it's my pleasure to invite Amanda Dunsmore. Amanda works in art processes that explore representations of societal transformation through portraiture. She engages in longitudinal research processes, and she presents her artworks through video, sound, photography, and installation. Her art processes are defined by a series of extensive socio-political, historical art projects. And central to her practice is an exploration of the potential future memory, the legacy of visual parity in portraiture, and the long-term implications of socio-political art making. And here she will discuss a series of portrait works exploring the methodology behind her artistic process. Amanda.
Thank you, Barbara. I research and make my portraits from a diverse range of political significant locations. Plan was made in 1997 whilst on residency in the Atelier Gallery in Weimar, in the former east of Germany. With the unification of Germany, metal enamel street signs were replaced quickly by plastic ones, with the old street signs were thrown in a bin awaiting disposal. I recovered and cleaned, document, and set up the ongoing preservation and storage of the street signs in Weimar. Geopolitical shifts affect people, and people's react are predictable in the quick discarding of the past. The perception of what is the representation, of place and their past. And I see this as artwork as a portrait of a historical portrait of place. People's reactions can also be unpredictable and surprising. Billy Hull was the senior officer in Her Majesty's Prison Maze here, and I met him in 1998 when I was artist in residence in the maze. Over a period of 15 years, Hull disobeyed an order to destroy materials, and instead he saved them. because of the nature of the artist in residence, I was bringing in cameras and recording equipment and working with the paramilitary prisoners. I was able to document what Billy had laid out in the old laundry building inside the maze. He'd laid them out on trestle tables. This is the resulting film, Billy's Museum, which is 20 minutes, and presents display of the objects he amassed. Because of my experience of working through and presenting politically sensitive content, I was commissioned to engage with the older LGBT community in County Galway. My art practice is grounded in the ethos of social practice. And the aim of the commission was to connect with this group of people who have lived through dramatic changes in Irish society and create a series of artworks and from their life experience. The currently touring exhibition, Becoming Christine, is a collaborative partnership with Christine Bainon. Becoming Christine is based on the lived experience of Christine as a continually developing body of work involving the representation of selfies, sound installation, video portraiture, and a publication. The selfies follow Christine's journey and the transition over the past 15 years. The legacy of Becoming Christine, in combining specific artist elements which together create an exhibition based in portraiture, is not only reflective of an individual finding themselves, but also reflective of the enormous social political change that has taken place in Ireland and England over the past 60 years. Becoming Christine, the exhibition, is an acknowledgement of this over time of society's progress. Christine's ongoing and remarkable journey to full self-realization and the bravery of this act make her a true pioneer. And as she states, every time she goes out the front door, she's making a political statement. Research is a key element of my art practice. Through researching into the artifacts that are in the previous film, Billy's Museum, I discovered the source of the images for the people's portraits, dating 1899 to 1918. The original glass plate negatives have contained both a side and profile images, and I selected and edited 100, which date from the date 1819 to 1918, which is before the partition of Ireland. I'm interested in how, firstly, these individuals are looking directly into the camera. For a lot of them, it would have been the first time that they had been photographed. Also, they are looking back at the audience, and they knew Ireland differently than we know Ireland. Also, they are convicts. And I'm interested in how the audience is today is able to equate themselves with these individuals more easily than prisoners today. Over 100 years, the audience has the space to shed the connotations of the prisoner and equate themselves more easily with them. "30 years closer in time, in 1996, the joint Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Mairead, Corrigan, Maguire, and Betty Williams here in Northern Ireland. This slide, these individuals represent a ground-up, non-partisan, civic, mainly women's movement. I had a specific intent in presenting this particular portrait alongside the portraits of David Trimble and John Hume in the recent exhibition at the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago. When I was an artist in residence, At one point, so I had access to all areas in the Maze prison, in all H blocks, apart from one area which was on lockdown because they had rioted. And I was in on the wing of the UDA, speaking to the officer in command. A week after the week that Mo Molan had gone in to speak to the Loyalist prisoners because they were going to pull out of the Good Friday Agreement. Mo Molan's action stayed with me, and she was the inspiration for the agreement portraits. When I filmed Martin McGuinness, sadly, Mo Molan passed away that morning. I also filmed David Irvine, the Progressive Unionist Party, who was also a prisoner in Long Kesh. David Trimble, by then Lord Trimble, Ulster Unionist Party, filmed in Banbridge, his constituency, last year. Lord Alderdice, Alliance Party, Northern Ireland, filmed in Belfast, 2005. Monica McWilliams, Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition, filmed in Belfast, 2005. John Hume, Social Democratic and Labour Party, or SDLP, filmed in Derry in 2005. This year I filmed Senator George Mitchell when he opened the exhibition in the Hugh Lane. And Senator Mitchell, for me, makes the connection, which is a very strong international connection through President Clinton. He was the envoy to the connection between America and, of course, the influence of the civil rights on the peace process through John Hume. I have 7 portraits filmed. There are 6 more to do. 2 have agreed. And for me, it's an ongoing, in my art practice, is the ongoing minding of the legacy of these individuals and what they embody. And just to finish, I will read the last section from my essay from the publication. Keeper is about people. The portraits of the peace people, the people's portraits, and the portraits of the key political figures involved in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement embody the people they represented. I had the privilege to meet and film key political figures who relate to Northern Ireland. When Mo Molan passed away, her death ended her presence. Her important contribution has become a faded generational memory, and her significant legacy resides in the words of others. With the death of David Irvine, Ian Paisley, and more recently of Martin McGuinness, societal memory continues to diminish. Their portraits are a formal, visual fragment and a representation of their remarkable legacies. Retained in Keeper is a potential for future memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And now I'd like to invite Seamus Nolan. Seamus is an artist based in Dublin. He is the recent recipient of the EU CAP, Collaborative Arts Participation Programme Commission, with the Hugh Lane in partnership with CREATE, the National Agency for Collaborative Art Practice, with his project, The Traveller's Collection, which is ongoing. Other works include Fourth Space for inhabiting the Bagion in Athens, Pronto Punks with Upstate Theatre Projects Drogheda, Free Shilan Oselec Mayo Arts Collaborative, Fuck Imma for What We Call Love, Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Trades Club Revival, which saw the revival of the traditional Workingman's Club in Sligo, and the attempted hijack of a Ryanair flight NM7104, and the refusal to participate in Dublin Contemporary 2011. Seamus.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm just going to speak about this one project because, as you said, it's an ongoing project, and things are being uncovered, and I'm just discovering things, and so it's kind of in the middle of the process. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about it. So the Traveller Collection project focuses on issues of traveller visibility within national and private cultural institutions, locating representations of travelling people and communities within local and national media. By this I mean within kind of all collections, private and public, where the traveller body begins to appear. Just in case anybody isn't aware, Irish Travellers are an Indigenous Irish group of nomadic people, and the attempts to assimilate travellers into kind of ordinary society, into sedentary society, has been kind of ongoing since the 60s. So in 2017, travellers, after about 30 years of campaigning, were granted ethnic, their status as an ethnic minority was recognised by the Irish state. So I thought at that time it was important to try to consider where travellers and their culture had existed. If it hadn't been an official culture by itself, where did it exist and what did it look like? And how would this sudden acknowledgement, what would it mean for those collections and for those communities? And how could something that was rendered invisible suddenly be made visible? And what would happen to the history that had went before that? So, yeah, I proposed to work with Pavey Point and with Tulane as part of the commission, and I was working with an ethnographer, Eve Olney, and we ran a series of workshops in traveller organisations and communities, which again are ongoing. The organisations and the communities are pretty much kind of on the periphery of most kind of civic spaces, and access to them is really kind of, it's complex and it takes some time. But eventually in June of this year, we had an exhibition in the Hugh Lane. And part of the exhibition was a proposal that I made to Pavey Point, the traveller organisation, and to the Hugh Lane, that we would look at works in the Hugh Lane collection that reference traveller culture. As it happens, you know, those works are not made by travellers, but to appear in those works as the subject, I think it's it needs to be kind of fleshed out. We need to kind of look at where those sites are and those where travellers become visible, and to begin to kind of interpret or critique what that visibility is and was. So one of the pieces that the only piece that we could actually transfer from the Hugh Lane collection to Pavey Point's centre was this piece by Jerome Connor called The Street Singer. And to launch it, there was like a traveller singer and a roundtable discussion. In the Hugh Lane, there was a traveller collection at Hugh Lane, which is what it was called, and these images to the right, some video works. There was music, there was handmade flowers and tin craft objects, and there was portraits from the Mick O'Dea collection, or sorry, the Martin Folan collection, which were painted by Mick O'Dea. There's also the Irish Travelling People's Resource Collection, which was put together by Aileen Lane in the University of Ulster from 1975 to 1998. And the collection, special collection in the University of Ulster is, we borrowed it, digitized it, and made it available online. So these are kind of the processes of trying to identify travellers within those collections and then to try and activate them or mobilize them somehow. But I also wanted to make a reference to, as an artist, another artist's work. This is Andrea Grayer, and her work is called Manifest from 2007. And this work asks, what do we need from museums in this current moment? So in the research that I was doing with Pavey Point and with Traveller Collection, during the workshops, we're asking people to bring in an object and for the communities to discuss that object. Is it heritage item? Is it cultural? Is it active? What relevance does it have? How would it be positioned? If a museum or a collection were to be kind of manifest, how would it be organized and how would these things occur? So in this manifest work, the questions that are being asked are again about trying to imagine the place of the museum in our time. Starting out, so she takes the writings of Grace McCann Morley, who was the founding director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, And then she adds contemporary voices to a list of demands, of pleas to the museum, inviting the viewer to imagine alongside her the space of a museum within the current social and political climate and what this could offer to civic society at large. So what we get from this work and these statements that are put forward is a very simple and very complex relationship to the museum. Firstly, access. You need to be able to access the museum. And when you enter these sites of cultural memory and meaning, you need to see yourself reflected back at you. And the third point is that when you see yourself reflected back to yourself, you have to have the power for that representation to turn and face you. So these are the kind of conceptual ideas of how you could position yourself in the museum and how the museum should position itself in relation to the people who visit. So the same questions we were asking to traveller communities and organisers. And this is Martin Collins, who's the co-director of Pavey Point. He described how the particular history of traveller culture, it's not just about documenting and celebrating culture and identity, but it's also about documenting the history and lived experience. And part of that history, if it has to be spelled out, is the ongoing exclusion, marginalisation, oppression, persecution, almost a type of a genocide without blood being spilled. Because at the end of the day, you're talking about getting rid of a people for their culture, their history, their identity, and their knowledge. So, I mean, it's a complex relationship between travellers and myself to begin with, but in trying to find spaces where we can discuss or facilitate how a traveller organisation, specifically cultural, specifically looking at these collections, how that might manifest. Again, Martin Collins' comments, he said that I think the fundamental issue is that the community must own the interpretation, the representation, and the management. So, we're trying to recognize where the traveller body exists within the museum and its visibility. So we're kind of asking, what is the relationship to this material? Some of the collections, for example, Harry Clarke, his illustration of James Stephens's Demigods, which was for the Geneva window in 1932, and Jack Butler Yeats's A Tinker from 1905. These are just like two examples of travellers being visible in museums, but the actual relationship to the traveller is very complex and kind of non-existent. And just the José Lanterns, he talks about the tinker trope in literature, and he says, between the creation of Irish literature theatre in 1899, with its nationalist aim of depicting Ireland as a home of the ancient and heroic idealism, and the formation of the Free State in 1922, when that idealism was put severely to the test, the tinker trope underwent a remarkable transformation from being the abstraction onto which Anglo-Irish nationalism projected all their desires and anxieties about the independent nation that was yet to be created, to becoming the embodiment of everything that was objectionable about the Irish past and worrisome about its future. So, when he says everything, I think he means everything. The perceptions of the traveller body, the concept of traveller culture, traveller identity, travellers being Irish. It's fundamentally an issue with Irishness and how it is divided. And just in terms of how travellers might enter a museum or find themselves in the museum, you have to remember there's huge kind of institutional barriers that would prevent this from happening, and there's huge cultural barriers. So, I mean, for example, like in the travelling community, there's 80% unemployment. There's 0.54% of travellers have completed third level. 16% are homeless. In the general population, 2% of travellers, or 2% of people are homeless, which is a huge national crisis, whereas in the travelling community, it's 16%. Suicide is 7 times higher, and life expectancy is between 11 and 15 years less. So these are huge, huge kind of issues around what prevents a traveller from recognising themselves in those collections. Because first of all, they may not have access to those museums. So the project is an ongoing sort of investigation and trying to develop links and earn trust and to try to facilitate these questions being asked and to establish what might be an appropriate way to proceed. Just in terms of museums, Anthony Camden is the keeper of the Country Life Museum in Mayo, and his analysis was very simple. They begin to address the invisibility or the lack of kind of visibility of travellers in collections. We need to kind of acknowledge that travellers have been marginalised in the collections. So even secondary representations of travellers are problematic in terms of travellers have no relationship to them, or the relationship is a very, very complex one, and without the traveller voice to interpret it, it doesn't bear representation, is what I'm going to say. So this is a piece of work that, as part of the Traveller collection, we invited Rosaline McDonough to write a piece based on an essay by Julie Brazil about Yeats's work on travellers. So Rosaline took Jack B. Yeats's singing "Oh, Had I the Wings of a Swallow," and she rewrote like her interpretation. She created an interpretation of it, and the work becomes this kind of dialogue between the subject of the work, being this traveller woman singing on a train, and the painter who is observing this. So she says that the subtlety of the painter's work encapsulates the presence and the inflection of authenticity. However, the problematic legacy of misappropriation, both politically and ethically, brings its own entangled contention. This lies between the artist's settled identity and the traveller of the painting's subject. My agitation remains close. The allegory within Yeats's work concerning travellers can only be understood by way of honouring his intent. So both the artist and the singer become the subject of the painting. The subject and the artist within the museum. So this is the point where we are with this project. I just wanted to present it because I think there are huge problematics around how traveller culture is represented, but looking specifically at culture and engaging with cultural institutions, I think the subject and the artist become the object of the artwork, and that's where I'll leave it.
Much, Seamus. And now I'd like to invite Owen Dara. Owen is an Irish curator based in Scotland, working as head of exhibitions at Dundee Contemporary Arts. At Dundee, he leads the curatorial team in multidisciplinary art centre, comprising 2 galleries, a 2-screen cinema, and a print production and research studio. Previously worked in Belfast as curator at the MAC and as co-director at Catalyst Arts. He also works collaboratively as 1/5 of the Household Curatorial Collective. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. I thought I'd put this up as an opening, in that this was the short abstract that I sent to Barbara a couple of weeks ago in thinking about what I might present today. And to read it quickly. It says, a short talk outlining an ongoing attempt to curate within public institutions from an intersectional feminist position, creating space to amplify voices that have been overlooked or underrepresented by dominant culture to date, and collaborating with contemporary artists to actively disrupt the systems of capitalism and patriarchy that control much of the world around us. So, it's only 56 words, which is pretty brief, but it's also one long, quite badly written, never-ending sentence. And within that, it's a bit tiresome, but at the same time, this is the nature of these things, I suppose, where you're trying to squeeze a million different things and thoughts and ideas and emotion into one brief description that will somehow hold everything, and it inevitably doesn't. And especially, it will not, cannot, if the broader subject that we're thinking about today is dissent. Dissent cannot be pinned down, summarized, or easily contained. It ought to be slippery. It ought to be ungraspable and out of reach, able to kind of seep out through the cracks and overflow over vessels that are attempting to hold it in one place. It's complex and it's uncomfortable, and it's a continual process of undoing and reshaping. And with that in mind, that's why I use the words ongoing here, and attempt. I see my work as a curator as a continual process of learning, usually from artists themselves, and learning about, or trying to learn about, the ways in which we can use art to call into question or to rail against some of the dominant and very often oppressive power structures that control much of the world around us. So what I'm just going to do for the next 10 minutes is profile some recent curatorial learning of sorts, to hopefully give a short glimpse into my way of working that I hope then might be useful to discuss further. So I live in Dundee. I'm head of exhibitions at Dundee Contemporary Arts, which is this lovely building here. We're a publicly funded cross-art form centre, and we're really the centre for contemporary art in the city. I've been in the role there for a year and a half and have been working to shift the gallery programme in some ways with our brilliant director, Beth Bate, to make dedicated space for artistic voices that position themselves against the status quo or that work against normative ways of looking at the world. One of our current projects in the galleries is the first solo show in Scotland by the Spanish artist Santiago Sierra. And Santiago, for 20-odd years now, has been carrying out these hugely provocative actions and projects around the world that do often to kind of seek to challenge hierarchies of power and systems of control that operate in modern society. And this exhibition represents one of his most ambitious undertakings to date. It takes the form, as you'll see, of a photographic and sound installation, the sound you will not see, documenting the process and performance of planting the universal symbol of the anarchist movement, the black flag, at either ends of the earth, at the North and South Pole. And within this performance, within this project, enact a kind of inversion of ownership at either end of the earth, a kind of denial of territory, a refusal of borders and nation states. And arguably, within all of this work, within this act, there is a performance, quite a distilled performance in some ways, of dissent. It's a hugely timely exhibition for a number of reasons, globally but also locally. We've been setting the show in the context of Dundee's own history of polar exploration. And audiences are engaging with this work on so many levels. And perhaps most importantly, it's throwing up, or it seems to be throwing up, many more questions than it is offering up answers. But to briefly come back to my abstract, I said that I'm trying to undertake curatorial work from an intersectional feminist position. And by that, I mean attempting to work at all times, both personally, professionally, and by extension, institutionally, to recognize and call out and actively try and resist a multitude of different repressive or discriminatory frameworks within the patriarchal society that we all still very much live in, that allow misogyny, racism, classism, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia to still thrive in public spaces. And museums and galleries, for me, are public space. In relation to our exhibitions program, more widely, I suppose, this means swiftly addressing many historical imbalances at DCA in terms of diversity, to commit major resources in the coming years to working, in the first instance, with women, with people of colour, with queer people, with trans and non-binary people, and other artists, voices, artistic communities, and communities in a wider sense that have been overlooked or underrepresented by dominant culture to date. Working in this way means recognizing personal and institutional privilege. I am a white male. DCA is a better resourced cultural space than many others in the city, and trying to recognize this privilege to then put it to productive use. Crucially, this means inviting different critical voices into the program in every single project that we do, and not simply stepping back after an exhibition opens, after opening night, to say, there it is, there's the work, there's the interpretive text, the work is done. And it means opening up space to be challenged institutionally. I mean, in some ways, Santiago has done this in spades already. We literally invited anarchy, or an idea of anarchy, into the building, and have stoked already burning conversations and questions in Dundee around nation states, around independence, around democracy in Scotland and further afield. And with Santiago's project, here was an exhibition, a body of ideas and a body of work that on the surface bears all the markings of dissent and disruption, of trying to upturn easily understood norms relating to borders, relating to territory, landscape, and the natural environment. And this is precisely how we profiled it in DCA. It's how I spoke about it in our interpretation. It's how I spoke about it in our talks and tours when the exhibition opened. But it's not without its contradictions and problems. Santiago knows that himself, and as an artist is very generously and intelligently open to being challenged and criticized. His work itself is rarely comfortable, so why should he be? And if the work is not comfortable, and he is not comfortable, the artist is not comfortable, then why should we be? Why should I be? Why should the institution be? Being productive with privilege means seeking out discomfort. Moments of discomfort are often moments of trying to comprehend something challenging, something new, something complex, and very often means that you can't be complacent. You recognize that you can always be doing better or trying to learn more. And if anyone's interested in that idea of discomfort in a radically productive way, I very much take that from Sarah Schulman's book, The Gentrification of the Mind, which is a remarkable text on the gentrification, really, of the cultural life and lived experience in New York after the AIDS crisis. But with this in mind, with this idea of discomfort, institutional, personal, professional discomfort, I invited the French-Japanese art worker, activist, academic, and writer, Nin Yamamoto Masson, to enact a kind of live takedown of the project at DCA, to give a performance lecture from her own very politicized position that revealed the ways in which Black Flag, unfortunately, still folds into certain systems of capitalism and patriarchy that perhaps on the surface it seems to position itself against. For example, the project itself was funded through corporate wealth, through a private individual funding a kind of commissioning art agency called Apolitical. The act of performing and planting these flags was delivered through a tourist industry at the poles that is hugely complicit in the destruction of these lands. The work also still positions the lone male figure as hero and savior in this idea of inversion or dissent. And in being so beautiful in some ways, in being stripped back and sumptuous and these gorgeous black and white photographs and exhibition kind of design, which Neen did not deny the kind of draw of that in the work, it actually flattens or eclipses the gritty reality of this type of endeavor. Also eclipses the violent colonial history of polar exploration and the very real contemporary struggles of indigenous peoples, for example, in these remote landscapes. Neen proposed to us, with us, that Black Flag and the institutional discourses around it operate simply in a realm of fantasy, creating projections that push themselves on top of and over the real struggles of people who have been brutally affected by these kinds of expeditions for centuries. By the end of the performance, she was really arguing that the entire project was actually antithetical to the core beliefs and ideas behind anarchism. And this was in the gallery, this was in our space, this was in public, with the work and with the audience. And from the moment she started speaking, really, my heart was in my mouth, and she really didn't hold back. And she really tore us to shreds in some ways. At one part, she had me read out excerpts of the interpretation that I had written to then interrupt me and challenge or disagree or tell me that I was incorrect or eclipsing or denying X, Y, and Z, which was terrifying to do in public in your own space, to be debunked and to be told otherwise. And within this kind of context, this became a really hugely productive act of live learning in public. She created a space where the institution, the curator, the artist and artwork, the critic, and very importantly, the public, our audiences, citizens, other citizens of Dundee, were all held together, were all challenged together, were all made to feel uncomfortable together, and it was fantastic. And I'm still very much learning from Neen, and now planning upcoming public programming around future seasons in the building to invite further voices of almost dissenters against perhaps artists that we think are already dissenting. And so basically what I'm perhaps putting out there for wider discussion is the idea that there are always these further layers of dissent to be sought out, to be activated within museums and galleries. And it is up to us as art workers, as directors or curators or artists or critics, to seek them out in order to learn from them, in order to do better. I believe in a wider sense that we need to trust artists, first and foremost, to do the radical, inspiring work that they've been doing for centuries, that they're doing right now, as we've already heard today. And these institutions holding art and culture and ideas and objects need to fit around the ideas and around the artists, not the other way around. We need to collaborate more. We need to throw out lots of multiple, when I say throw out, I mean extend as opposed to dispose of, multiple positions. We need to resist linear narratives and sole authorship. We need to resist single interpretations. We need to invite criticism, active criticism. We need to be held accountable, and we need to be trusting of our audiences as well, and trust in their intelligence and sophistication to grapple with complex ideas and ever-moving kind of ideas. Now I feel in the widest possible sense, beyond the discipline that we're working in, that we need to be polyvocal. We need a cacophony of voices speaking and working together towards better means and better ends from many different positions. We need not all blend in or blend together. We need not all sing off the same hymn sheet, or we need not all sing at all in some ways. Harmony at this stage of the game feels supremely overrated, and I think we need to put more trust back into artists to create collections and projects and histories for our future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. So we have had some varied viewpoints. From Amanda has been discussing the methodology behind our process, which examines place, people, and moments of political significance, and the role of art practice in minding the legacy of individuals, ideas, and perspectives of human interaction. Seamus has been discussing a particular ethnic group, the travelling community, the role of the museum, how access is seen, how it is interpreted, and the issues of control, barrier, identity, and representation. And Owen has just finished. I think do not shy away from dissent. Have dissent as the starting point for curatorial practice, and multiple viewpoints that are essential in understanding the complexities of the issues that we're discussing, and also the complexities, indeed, of our own personalities. I imagine in order to rule effectively, the more you can streamline things, the easier it is. And certainly when we were having the centenary of the 1916 Rising, a lot of us museums that were more modern and contemporary without historical collections were challenged as to how we could do this and how we could make it relevant. And of course it was by looking at our contemporary artists, where are we now? And how do we look back at what went before? Putting back, of course, all that had been ironed out, all of the all of the different persuasions and religions, all of the vegetarians, the gays, the lesbians, Quakers, the suffragettes, all of the different philosophers and thinkers that had sort of fallen away in an attempt to have a sort of a very narrow main road. And I think that has been hugely successful and has been very much due to the efforts of all the artists. So now I'd like to open it to the floor and to have some questions. Does anybody have a question for the panel? And do we have a mic? I'm sure we do. We have a microphone. Has anybody? Oh, great. There's somebody over here. Yeah, oh, and we should bring the house lights up, please, so we can see people. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. My name's Helen Hart, Steen, and I'm from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery in Exeter. And I just wondered about how do we reconcile the fact that we're trying to represent those people that we say perhaps are underrepresented or don't have a voice, but in a space and through sometimes media that aren't very accessible to some of those people themselves, some of these audiences. So I know that we find it very difficult for kind of a lot of people to feel like they can step into a contemporary art exhibition. So how do we reconcile those two things?
Would you like to start, Owen?
Sure. I would say first and foremost by really owning up to the reality of that, and saying that, because I feel like a lot of museums and galleries at the moment are saying that we're kind of through learning programs and things like that those barriers are being broken down and this, that, and the other. But the reality is that art, in a wider sense, for a lot of people, is still terrifying. In my experience, contemporary art is right up there in terms of being a difficult subject to enter into. I suppose if I'm only speaking in terms of my institution, one way that we do that in DCA is to try and make sure that audiences are using the building in lots of different ways and know and get to know the building through the way in which that we kind of shape it. So alongside the exhibition program in the galleries, we have 2 cinemas, we have a print studio, we have a restaurant, bar, and then we have a learning program that, you know, sits across the whole organization. And one of the loveliest ways of cross-pollinating audiences in that sense is trying to get people who are coming into the cinema. If I'm working with a video artist, for example, or a film artist, which we typically, you know, are often enough, that we talk to people in the cinemas beforehand about the differences in what they will see in a black box space of a cinema versus what they might see with film or moving image if they just take a look upstairs after, you know, after the screening or whatever, and try and shift things differently there. Also, this is maybe not that helpful and very specific, but it was a remarkable shift. Whenever I started, just before I started last year, there were always temporary walls built just on the inside doors of both of our galleries that kind of sealed them off and blocked out a bit of noise and blocked out, you know, the kind of cacophony of the building itself to create that white cube, you know, sacred chapel to art. And we took them down straight away, and that physical act of just opening the gallery door and making that threshold between the public spaces, the restaurant and the bar, and a space where you might see art much muddier, really did a great deal.
Have you, Amanda, what did you think?
I do. Invite artists to come in and give them time to work. Artists will research, they will consider, artists can bridge the gap, and by what I mean by time, there is no quick fix and there is no quick answer to this. Institutions are complex, and there are many people in many positions who have many personal agendas as well as public agendas, but artists can negotiate and move where other people can't. They have no agendas. And when you set, apart from representation of the body of people that you wish to come in, that you've targeted for the artist to look at, and give them freedom. If you write a brief, write a good brief, but allow them to grow within the brief. When I was given the brief to work with the LGBT community in County Galway, older County Galway, so this was a doubly invisible community. They're old and they're gay. So I was given a year, and I needed actually 3. I met Christine at the end. So think about 3-year briefs. Think about 5 years.
It's the longevity of a project rather than a very short term, because if you, Seamus, would you like to add to that? Like the process is part of the process, also is part of the whole. If you're talking about an exhibition, the process, the thinking behind it, the actual doing of it, and even the feedback afterwards. It's all part of the artistic endeavour.
Yeah, absolutely. Just echo those points made, but I also think that the the artists and the museums have the ability to not operate just in the museum, to extend beyond those boundaries. I mean, it is great, like, to muddy the waters or to have the time to consider and to develop and bridge those gaps. But it's also like the people, the communities that you're engaging with are simply people, and it's generally about trust and about bringing the museum somehow to those people. So, like, I think that the museum is strong enough to be able to do that. I think, people believe in the museum, and it's the repository for our memory, our cultural meanings and stuff, and it's kind of unshakable in a lot of ways. So it can be challenged, it can be pushed and stretched, and I think it can, enter communities in a way that should be as imaginative as curators and artists are being within museums and galleries.
So to have a bridge between the community and the more static structure, which is the museum. Would anybody else like to comment, or do we have another question? Over there. Anybody? You know, we talk about the complexity of the museum, and for those of us who run museums and who manage museums, we do, I suppose, have our own ways of negotiating both through the artists and our communities. And you did mention, Seamus, barriers there and representation. Do you feel that the museums have improved this notion of, you know, you step into a hallowed place and this is for a certain type of person? Has that improved, do you think, in the identity of museums and museum curation?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of improving. I mean, I think it's simply, it has to reflect the people who use it. Of course, you can get better at that, but when I was talking about Anthony Condon's his essay on dissolving the boundaries of the museum, you know, it's not necessarily important to redress those things, because redress is not really how you build something new. If something is missing, maybe it needs to be there, but to be there just by redress is a kind of maybe a tokenist sort of gesture. So I think that the museum has to be as open to fail as the artist and the artwork is.
Yeah. Because I think it's never really a fail, isn't it? It's always an experiment. And certainly, perhaps to answer that also is the type of curation and the type of programs have then, as you say, representation rather than we must be better. No, you actually have, as Owen said, dissent as a starting point and have multiple viewpoints. So the programs in the museum that come into the museum should be programs from different sectors, from different communities, and that they all have a parity, as you were saying, Amanda, parity. So that, but when they all have different viewpoints, there will be different responses and different reactions. And we, as curators and museum people, should be open and ready for that. And I think that's the great thing. We never actually make a huge mistake. It's actually, that one didn't really work, but let's try it this way. And I think that is recognized as very important in our field.
I think it also, I mean, the idea, I think creating space for failure or for things not to work out in institutions, it makes them human as well. It opens it up in such a way that people that perhaps would have always seen that organization or that building or that space as something impenetrable, to see that they can make mistakes in, as I was saying, in a live way, and acknowledge them, bring it into their ideas of how they're articulating their projects, and learn from them in public, be public and open about those things. It makes us all more human, and therefore more easily to relate to.
And just to maybe to answer a question that came up in a previous session, and it was about this fear of a certain demographic of audience, that there would seem to be a fear of inviting this audience into institutions. And having worked personally with individuals who would have imparted fear upon society, paramilitary organisation individuals, everybody is human. There is always the way to make a human contact with an individual, and artists are very good at bringing it down to that human contact of how you do that.
Yeah, and it's very difficult, really, if you go about a project with research and a genuine goal of participation and representation and listening. It's very difficult, actually, to fail. You may not get the statistics you want, like how many people came in, what was that. But I sometimes think even if you get 3 people that have actually been engaged in something, that certainly it is in itself a success, mightn't be overall success. I think our time is, I notice lights moving a little, I think our time is up. Thank you very much for coming to this session. I'd like to again thank artist Amanda Dunsmore and Seamus Nolan and curator Owen Dara, and thank you very much for listening to us this afternoon.